Welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe for the best Reddit creepypasta stories, perfect for bedtime chills. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the story. We gathered at Josh's place around 8 p.m. It was just the two of us, a couple of beers, and the old dusty Ouija board he found in his attic. The thing looked ancient with faded letters and a worn-out planchette. It gave off an eerie vibe, but I shrugged it off. It was just a game, after all. Josh had also found a book of rituals. It was full of weird, arcane instructions, and one in particular caught our eye. It was called the Candle Summoning. According to the book, if you placed 6 candles in a circle around the Ouija board and chanted a specific incantation, you could summon a spirit. We laughed at the absurdity of it, but decided to give it a shot. What could go wrong, right? We set up the candles as instructed, forming a perfect circle around the board. Josh turned off the lights, and the flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was spooky, but I was still more amused than scared. "Ready?" Josh asked, holding the book open to the incantation page. "Ready," I replied, feeling a twinge of excitement. We both placed our fingers on the planchette and started chanting the incantation. The words felt strange on my tongue, almost like they weren't meant to be spoken. As we chanted, the temperature in the room seemed to drop and a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, the planchette started moving. I thought Josh was messing with me, but his wide-eyed expression told me he was just as surprised as I was. The planchette moved slowly, deliberately, spelling out words. S-P-I-R-I-T. We both froze. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just a game. But the air around us felt charged, almost electric. The candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. "What the hell?" Josh whispered, his voice trembling. Before I could respond, the planchette moved again, this time more forcefully. I-A-M-H-E-R-E. My heart pounded in my chest. This couldn't be real. We were just playing a game, but everything in the room felt wrong, like we had crossed a line we weren't supposed to. "Who's here?" I asked, my voice shaking. The planchette moved quickly, almost angrily. D-E-A-T-H. I felt a cold hand grip my heart. This was no longer fun and games. We had summoned something dark and malevolent. The temperature continued to drop, and I could see my breath in the candlelight. "We need to stop," I said, pulling my hand away from the planchette. Josh nodded, but before we could do anything, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. We were plunged into darkness, and I felt a presence, something cold and evil surrounding us. The room felt like it was closing in, and I could hear whispers, faint and sinister, all around us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a primal fear I had never experienced before. Suddenly, Josh screamed. I turned towards him, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. His screams were cut off abruptly, replaced by a choking, gurgling sound. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. What I saw made my blood run cold. Josh was on the floor, convulsing. His eyes rolled back in his head. Dark, shadowy tendrils seemed to be wrapping around him, squeezing the life out of him. I wanted to help, but I was paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The tendrils vanished, and Josh lay still, his chest rising and falling rapidly. I rushed to his side, shaking him. Josh, are you okay?" He opened his eyes, and I saw pure terror in them. We need to get out of here," he gasped. I helped him to his feet, and we stumbled out of the house, not daring to look back. We didn't speak, just drove aimlessly until we felt we were far enough away. The silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken horror of what we had just experienced. When we finally stopped, we sat in the car, shaking. "What the hell was that?" I finally managed to say. Josh shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know, but we need to find a way to stop it." Neither of us slept that night. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Every sound made us jump. We knew we had opened a door we couldn't easily close, and whatever we had summoned wasn't going to leave us alone. That was just the beginning. The real horror was yet to come, and it would change our lives forever. The next day, I woke up with a sense of dread lingering over me. Josh and I had spent the night in my car, too scared to go back to his house. We knew we needed to do something, but neither of us had any idea where to start. We decided to go back to my place to regroup and figure out our next steps. As we walked into my apartment, the air felt heavy and oppressive, like a storm was brewing. Josh was pale and jittery, constantly looking over his shoulder. I tried to reassure him and myself that we would find a way to fix this. Little did we know, our nightmare was just beginning. We sat down in my living room, trying to piece together what had happened. "We need to find a way to reverse the ritual," Josh said, his voice shaky. "Maybe the book has something," I suggested. "We should go back and get it." Josh's eyes widened with fear. "Are you crazy? We can't go back there." "We have to," I insisted. "We need that book. It's our only chance." Reluctantly, Josh agreed. We drove back to his house in silence, the fear hanging over us like a dark cloud. As we pulled up to his driveway, I felt my heart race. The house looked different, more menacing somehow. We cautiously entered, the front door creaking ominously. The house was eerily quiet, and the air was thick with an unnatural cold. We made our way to the living room, where the Ouija board and candles were still set up. The board seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the room felt like it was watching us. Josh quickly grabbed the book, and we bolted out of there, not daring to look back. Back at my apartment, we pored over the book, searching for anything that could help us reverse the ritual. But the more we read, the more hopeless it seemed. There was nothing about reversing the ritual or banishing spirits. We were on our own. That night, the haunting began. It started with small things. Doors would open and close on their own, lights would flicker, and I would hear strange noises in the middle of the night. At first, I tried to brush it off, blaming it on my imagination. But it quickly escalated. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a whispering voice right next to my ear. It was faint, but I could make out the words. "You can't escape." I jumped up, my heart pounding, and turned on the lights, but there was nothing there. I barely slept, haunted by the feeling of being watched. Josh was experiencing similar things. He called me one night, panicked. "It's here," he whispered. "I can feel it. It's watching me." We knew we couldn't go on like this. We needed help. We decided to reach out to a local paranormal investigator, someone who might know how to deal with this. We found a guy named Carl, who had a reputation for dealing with hauntings and other supernatural occurrences. Desperate, we set up a meeting. Carl was an older man, with a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened to our story without judgment, nodding occasionally. When we finished, he leaned back and sighed. "You've messed with something you don't understand. Summoning spirits is dangerous, especially when you don't know what you're doing." "Can you help us?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I can try," he said, "but this isn't going to be easy. You need to be prepared for whatever comes next." We agreed to let Carl come to my apartment and perform a cleansing ritual. He brought with him an array of strange tools and herbs, muttering incantations under his breath as he worked. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. As Carl worked, the temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath, and a dark shadow seemed to move in the corners of the room. Carl continued his ritual, his voice growing louder and more urgent. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the apartment, and the candles he had lit were extinguished. "It's fighting back," Carl said, his voice grim. "This spirit is strong. We need to be careful." The room grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and for a split second, I saw a figure, a dark, shadowy form with glowing red eyes. It was only there for a moment, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. Carl continued the ritual, his voice now a commanding roar. The shadowy figure seemed to writhe in pain, and the air was filled with an unearthly screech. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The temperature returned to normal. and the oppressive feeling lifted. "It's done," Carl said, wiping sweat from his brow. "For now, at least. But this spirit is powerful. It won't give up easily." We thanked Carl and paid him for his services, but he left us with a warning. "Be careful," he said. "This spirit knows you now. It will try to come back. Stay strong and don't give in to fear." That night, for the first time in days, I slept soundly. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The spirit was still out there, and it wouldn't rest until it had what it wanted. And what it wanted, I feared, was us. The days passed, and Josh and I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. The haunting seemed to have stopped after Carl's ritual, and we began to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But deep down, I knew the peace was temporary. The spirit wasn't gone, it was waiting. One evening, Josh called me in a panic. "It's back," he said, his voice trembling. "I can feel it. It's stronger this time." I could hear the fear in his voice, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "I'll be right over," I said, grabbing my keys and rushing out the door. When I arrived at Josh's place, he looked pale and haggard, like he hadn't slept in days. The air in his apartment felt thick and oppressive, just like the night we first summoned the spirit. "It started with the whispers again," he said, his eyes darting around the room. Then I saw it. Just a glimpse, but it was there. We decided to call Carl again, but when we tried to reach him, his phone went straight to voicemail. Desperation set in. We were on our own. That night, we decided to stay together, hoping that our combined strength would be enough to ward off the spirit. We set up in Josh's living room, keeping all the lights on, hoping that the brightness would keep the darkness at bay. As the hours passed, the tension in the room grew. We talked about anything and everything to keep our minds off the looming threat, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of our minds. Around midnight, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. Our breath fogged in the cold air, and a sense of dread washed over us. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing on the walls. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the darkness. The sound sent chills down my spine. I turned to Josh, his face pale with fear. "It's here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The growl grew louder, and the lights flickered more violently. We huddled together, our eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, a shadowy figure materialized in the corner of the room. It was tall and dark, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through us. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of malevolence. It started to move towards us, slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Josh and I scrambled to our feet, backing away as the figure advanced. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to reach out towards us. The figure raised a hand, and I felt a crushing pressure on my chest, making it hard to breathe. "We need to get out of here," I gasped, grabbing Josh's arm and pulling him towards the door. We stumbled out of the apartment, the oppressive presence following us. We ran to my car and sped away, not stopping until we were miles away from Josh's place. We pulled over on a deserted road, both of us gasping for breath. "What the hell are we going to do?" Josh said, his voice shaking. "We need to find out what it wants," I said. "There has to be a reason it's after us." We drove to the nearest library, hoping to find some answers. We spent hours poring over books on the occult and the supernatural, trying to find anything that matched our experiences. Finally, we came across a passage that sent chills down my spine. The book described a ritual similar to the one we had performed, warning of the dangers of summoning malevolent spirits. It mentioned that such spirits often attach themselves to the living, feeding off their fear and despair. The only way to banish them was to confront them and perform a binding ritual to seal them away. "We need to do this," I said, showing the passage to Josh. "It's our only hope." Josh nodded, his face pale but determined. "Let's do it." We gathered the necessary materials for the binding ritual: salt, candles, and a piece of iron. The instructions were clear. We needed to create a circle of protection, confront the spirit, and use the iron to bind it. That night, We returned to my apartment, setting up the ritual in the living room. The air was thick with tension, and every sound made us jump. We lit the candles and drew a circle of salt around us, holding the piece of iron tightly. We began the ritual, chanting the incantation we had found in the book. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to close in around us. The spirit appeared, its red eyes glowing with rage. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice echoing in the room. "We're not afraid of you," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We know how to stop you." The spirit snarled, its form shifting and writhing. It lunged towards us, but the circle of salt held it back. We continued the incantation, the words growing stronger and more confident. As we chanted, the spirit seemed to weaken, its form flickering and fading. The air was filled with an unearthly screech, and the temperature dropped even further. I could feel the iron growing warm in my hand, and I knew we were close. With a final, desperate effort, we completed the ritual. The iron glowed red hot, and the spirit let out a final, ear-piercing scream before it vanished, leaving the room in silence. We collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive presence was gone. We had done it. We had banished the spirit. But as we lay there, catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The spirit might be gone, but the scars it left behind would never fade. And I knew, deep down, that we would never be the same. The following days were eerily quiet. The haunting presence that had terrorized us seemed to have vanished entirely. Josh and I both tried to move on with our lives, but the experience had left an indelible mark on us. We didn't talk much about what had happened, as if speaking of it might somehow bring it back. Josh and I began to drift apart. He couldn't bear to stay in his apartment, so he moved in with his parents temporarily. I stayed in my place, but every creak, every shadow made my heart race. It was like living on a knife's edge, always expecting something to jump out at me. One night, as I was lying in bed, I received a call from Josh. His voice was frantic. "It's back," he whispered. "I don't know how, but it's back." My blood ran cold. "Are you sure?" I asked, hoping he was just imagining things. "I'm sure," he said, his voice trembling. "I can hear it. The whispers. It's watching me." I felt a wave of panic. We had done everything right, hadn't we? "I'll be right over," I said, grabbing my keys and heading out the door. When I arrived at Josh's parents' house, the atmosphere was tense. The air felt thick and there was an oppressive silence hanging over the place. Josh met me at the door, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "It's worse this time," he said, leading me inside. "It feels angrier." We sat in his bedroom, trying to figure out what to do. We had performed the binding ritual correctly, but somehow the spirit had found its way back. I felt a sense of dread settle in my stomach. If the ritual hadn't worked, what hope did we have? As we sat there, the temperature in the room began to drop. I could see my breath, and an all too familiar sense of dread washed over me. The whispers started, faint and sinister, growing louder and more insistent. "It's here," Josh whispered, his eyes darting around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to writhe and shift, and a dark figure materialized. Its red eyes glowed with malevolence, and it seemed larger and more menacing than before. "You cannot escape me," it hissed, its voice echoing in the room. Josh and I backed away, fear gripping our hearts. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The spirit's eyes seemed to bore into mine. "You," it whispered. "I want you." A wave of terror washed over me. This spirit wasn't just haunting us, it wanted to possess us. I felt a cold hand close around my heart, and I struggled to breathe. The room seemed to close in around us, the air thick with malevolent energy. "We need to leave," I gasped, grabbing Josh's arm. We bolted out of the house, not stopping until we were in my car. We drove aimlessly, trying to put as much distance between us and the spirit as possible. We ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town, exhausted and terrified. We knew we couldn't run forever, but we needed a plan. I pulled out my phone and started searching for anything that might help. After hours of searching, I found a forum dedicated to paranormal investigations. I posted our story, hoping someone might have an answer. It didn't take long for replies to come in. Most were skeptical or unhelpful, but one stood out. A user named Mystic Warrior claimed to have dealt with similar situations before. "You're dealing with a powerful entity," they wrote. "Binding rituals alone won't work. You need to find out why it's attached to you. Spirits like this feed off fear and pain. There might be something in your past or something you did that drew it to you." I shared the message with Josh. "We need to think back," I said. "There has to be something that triggered this." We spent hours going over everything that had happened since the ritual. It was then that Josh remembered something. "The book," he said, his eyes wide. The book was already open to the page with the ritual. I thought it was weird at the time, but I didn't think much of it. A chill ran down my spine. "What if the book was a trap?" I suggested. "What if it was meant to summon this spirit?" Josh's face went pale. "We need to destroy it." We drove back to Josh's parents' house, the dread hanging over us like a dark cloud. The house was silent when we arrived, and we quietly made our way to his room. The book was still there, sitting on his desk. As we approached, the air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling returned. The spirit materialized in front of us, its red eyes glowing with anger. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed. "I will always find you." Josh grabbed the book, and I pulled out a lighter. The spirit lunged at us, but we held our ground. I lit the corner of the book, and it went up in flames. The spirit screamed, a sound that pierced my very soul, and the air around us seemed to warp and distort. The book burned quickly, the flames consuming it entirely. The spirit writhed and twisted, its form flickering and fading. With a final agonized scream, it vanished, and the oppressive feeling lifted. We stood there, panting and trembling. The air felt lighter, and the house was silent once more. "Is it over?" Josh asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think so," I said, my heart still pounding. "I hope so." We left the house, still shaken, but relieved. We knew we had to be careful, but for the first time, in what felt like forever, we felt a glimmer of hope. We had faced the darkness and come out the other side. But deep down, I knew the scars would never truly heal. The spirit might be gone, but the memories of its haunting would stay with us forever. Josh and I tried to rebuild our lives after destroying the book. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive presence seemed to have finally lifted. For a few weeks, we managed to convince ourselves that it was truly over, but the peace was fleeting, and the final chapter of our nightmare was yet to unfold. One night, as I was preparing for bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. The text read, "You can't escape." My blood ran cold. The spirit was back, and it had found a new way to torment us. I called Josh immediately. "It's back," I said, my voice trembling. "I got a message." Josh was silent for a moment before he spoke. "We need to end this once and for all," he said with a grim determination. "We need to find out why it's so attached to us." We agreed to meet the next day to do some more digging. Josh suggested visiting the town's historical archives, hoping to uncover any information about the book or the spirit. It was a long shot, but we had no other leads. The following morning, we arrived at the old library. The building was musty, filled with rows of ancient books and documents. We spent hours sifting through the archives, looking for anything that might give us a clue. Finally, we stumbled upon an old journal that mentioned a series of rituals performed by a cult in the 1800s. The cult had been trying to summon a powerful spirit, believed to grant immense power to those who controlled it. As we read further, we discovered that the cult's rituals had gone horribly wrong. The spirit they summoned was too powerful, and it had turned on them, resulting in their gruesome deaths. The journal mentioned a final, desperate attempt to bind the spirit to a book, trapping it for eternity. "That must be the book we found," Josh said, his eyes wide with realization. "We didn't destroy the spirit, we just released it." The journal also mentioned a final ritual, one that could banish the spirit permanently. It required confronting the spirit at the place where it was first summoned and performing a cleansing ritual with a special artifact, a pendant made of obsidian that the cult had used in their ceremonies. We scoured the archives for any mention of the pendant and eventually found a reference to it being kept in a local museum. With renewed hope, we headed to the museum and managed to convince the curator to let us see the artifact. The obsidian pendant was small, but it radiated a strange, dark energy. Armed with the pendant and the instructions from the journal, we knew what we had to do. We had to return to the house where it all began and perform the ritual there. That night, we arrived at Josh's old house. The place was even more foreboding than before, shrouded in darkness and silence. We entered cautiously, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on us. We set up in the living room, the same place where we had performed the original ritual. We arranged the candles and drew a protective circle with salt. Holding the obsidian pendant, we began the cleansing ritual. As we chanted, the air grew colder, and the oppressive presence returned. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, and the spirit materialized before us, its red eyes glowing with fury. "You cannot banish me," it hissed, its voice echoing with malice. "We have the power to end this," I said, my voice steady. "You have no hold over us anymore." The spirit lunged at us, but the protective circle held it back. We continued the ritual, our voices growing stronger and more confident. The obsidian pendant began to glow with a dark light, and the spirit screeched in pain. With a final, desperate effort, we completed the ritual. The pendant's light intensified, and the spirit let out an ear-piercing scream before it was sucked into the pendant. The room fell silent, and the oppressive feeling lifted. We collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, we felt truly free. "It's over," Josh said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think it is," I replied, my heart still pounding. We did it. We left the house, the obsidian pendant now a symbol of our victory. We decided to bury it in a place where no one would ever find it, ensuring the spirit would remain trapped forever. As we walked away, I felt a sense of closure. The nightmare was finally over. The spirit was gone, and we could finally move on with our lives. But the memories of those harrowing weeks would always be with us, a reminder of the darkness we had faced and overcome. Josh and I remained close, bound by the shared trauma and our victory over the malevolent spirit. We knew we would never be the same, but we also knew we had faced something truly terrifying and survived, and that in itself was a victory. The haunting was over, but the lessons we learned about fear, courage, and the unknown would stay with us forever. We had faced the darkness and come out the other side, stronger and wiser. The spirit was gone, but our bond and the memories of our ordeal would remain, a testament to our resilience and determination. As the years passed, we found new paths and new lives, always remembering the horror we had faced and the strength we had found in each other. The nightmare was over, but the story of our survival would live on, a cautionary tale of the dangers of the unknown and the power of the human spirit. It was a freezing, pitch-black evening. I had just finished a late shift at the diner where I work and was looking forward to getting home to my warm bed. My car was parked in the usual spot, under a flickering streetlight that did little to cut through the darkness. As I approached my car, I noticed something odd in the back seat. Squinting through the frosted window, I saw a wooden box with strange carvings on it. My first thought was that someone had broken into my car and left it there as some kind of prank. I looked around, but the street was deserted. With a sigh, I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, shivering as I started the engine. I hesitated for a moment before reaching back to grab the box. It was heavier than I expected, the wood cold to the touch. I brought it to the front seat and set it down next to me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the lid. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was an old Ouija board and a planchette. The board was intricately designed, the letters and numbers almost glowing in the dim light from my car's interior. A chill ran down my spine. I live alone, and there's no one I could think of who would leave such a thing in my car. The rational part of my mind told me to throw it away, but something about it drew me in. I drove home with the board on the passenger seat, glancing at it every now and then, as if expecting it to move on its own. When I got home, I took the board inside, placing it on the coffee table. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange mixture of fear and fascination. Eventually, I went to bed, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. That night, I had the most vivid nightmares I've ever experienced. I was in a dark room, lit only by a single candle. The air was thick with the smell of burning wax and something else, something rotten. I could hear whispers all around me, too quiet to understand, but loud enough to make my skin crawl. In the centre of the room was the Ouija board, the planchette moving on its own, spelling out words I couldn't read. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding. The next morning, I found the board still on the coffee table, just as I had left it. But the planchette had moved. It was now resting on the letter H. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Objects in my apartment would move on their own. I'd come home to find cupboards open, lights turned on, and the TV blaring static. At night, I'd hear faint whispers, like someone was standing right behind me. Sleep became impossible. One evening, I decided to use the board, hoping it would give me some answers. I lit a few candles and turned off all the lights, creating an eerie atmosphere. With trembling hands, I placed my fingers on the planchette and asked the first question that came to mind. Who are you? For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. It spelled out a single word. Help! My breath caught in my throat. I asked another question. What do you want? Again, the planchette moved, this time spelling out, save me. I felt a cold draft sweep through the room, making the candles flicker. My fear turned into a mix of terror and pity. Whatever was communicating with me seemed desperate. I continued asking questions, learning that the spirit was a young woman named Sarah, who had died tragically. She claimed to be trapped, unable to move on. She begged me to help her, but I had no idea how. The more I used the board, the more intense the hauntings became. The whispers grew louder, the nightmares more terrifying. One night, I woke up to find Sarah standing at the foot of my bed. She was pale, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she pointed to the Ouija board on my bedside table. I knew then that I couldn't ignore her plea any longer. I had to find a way to help her, to end this nightmare. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I needed to know more about Sarah, about the board, and about how to break whatever curse I'd inadvertently brought upon myself. I spent hours online, reading everything I could find about Ouija boards and hauntings. Most of it seemed like nonsense, but I found a few stories that were eerily similar to mine. I learned that Ouija boards were originally designed as a way to communicate with the dead, but they could also open doors to darker entities. The more I read, the more I realized how dangerous this situation could be. But amidst the fear, I also found hope. There were rituals and prayers that people claimed could cleanse a haunted space and free trapped spirits. Determined to help Sarah and rid myself of this curse, I decided to visit a local spiritual shop. The place was small and cluttered, filled with the scent of incense and old books. An elderly woman behind the counter greeted me with a knowing smile. I explained my situation, and she listened intently, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she handed me a bundle of sage and a small vial of holy water. "You need to cleanse your home," she said. "Burn the sage, sprinkle the holy water, and recite this prayer." She handed me a piece of paper with a handwritten prayer. It won't be easy, but it should help. That night, I followed her instructions to the letter. I walked through my apartment, burning the sage and sprinkling the holy water, all while reciting the prayer. The air felt heavy, like something was resisting my efforts, but as I continued, I felt a shift. The whispers quieted, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. When I reached the living room, where the Ouija board still sat on the coffee table, I hesitated. The planchette had moved again, now resting on the letter D. Taking a deep breath, I sprinkled the holy water over the board and recited the prayer once more. The candles flickered violently, and a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing them. I stood in darkness, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, I heard a faint voice. It was Sarah, her tone desperate yet grateful. "Thank you," she whispered, "but it's not over yet." Before I could respond, she was gone, leaving me alone in the silent room. The next few days were uneventful. The hauntings seemed to have stopped, and for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. But the sense of unease never fully left me. Sarah's last words echoed in my mind. "It's not over yet." One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. "You're in danger," it read. "Meet me at the old church on Elm Street at midnight. Come alone." My heart raced. Who could this be? How did they know about my situation? Despite my fear, I felt compelled to go. I needed answers, and this might be my only chance to get them. I grabbed my coat and headed out into the cold night. The old church was a dilapidated building, long abandoned and rumoured to be haunted. It stood at the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown weeds and crumbling tombstones. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. In the dim light, I saw a figure standing at the altar. It was an elderly man, his face lined with age and worry. He introduced himself as Father Thomas, a retired priest who had spent his life dealing with the supernatural. "You've been marked," he said, his voice grave. "That board you found was a trap, set by a malevolent spirit. Sarah is not what she seems." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But she asked for my help," I protested. "She seemed so desperate." Father Thomas shook his head. "Spirits can be deceptive. They'll use any means necessary to get what they want. Sarah is trapped, yes, but freeing her will unleash something far worse. You need to destroy the board and perform a final cleansing ritual to banish her for good." He handed me a book filled with ancient rites and symbols. "Follow the instructions carefully. This will be your only chance." I thanked him and hurried home, my mind racing. I had no choice but to trust him. I had to end this once and for all. Back at my apartment, I prepared for the ritual. I gathered the items Father Thomas had instructed me to use: candles, salt, and a vial of blessed oil. I set the Ouija board in the center of the living room and drew a circle of salt around it. As I lit the candles and opened the book, I felt a palpable tension in the air. The words of the ritual were in Latin, and as I began to chant, the temperature in the room dropped. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Halfway through the ritual, the planchette began to move on its own, spelling out frantic messages. Stop, please, and no. I forced myself to keep going, even as a cold wind howled through the room, threatening to blow out the candles. Suddenly, I heard a blood-curdling scream. Sarah appeared before me, her eyes wide with terror. "You don't understand," she cried. "You're making a mistake." Her voice echoed through the room, filled with anguish. I faltered, my resolve wavering. But then I remembered Father Thomas's warning. I had to see this through. I resumed the chant, my voice growing stronger with each word. Sarah's form began to waver, her screams growing louder and more desperate. The planchette moved violently, spelling out curses and threats. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Finally, with a final, resounding word, I completed the ritual. The candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a deafening roar filled the air. Followed by a blinding flash of light, I was thrown back, hitting the wall with a painful thud. When I came to, the room was eerily quiet. The Ouija board lay in pieces on the floor, the planchette shattered, Sarah was gone, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. In the days that followed, I cautiously returned to my normal routine. The hauntings had ceased, and I no longer felt the oppressive presence that had plagued me for so long. I threw away the remnants of the Ouija board and cleaned my apartment thoroughly, determined to put the whole ordeal behind me. But the experience had left its mark. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only scratched the surface of a much deeper, darker truth. I avoided talking about it with anyone, fearing they would think I was crazy. But late at night, when the shadows seemed to move on their own and the silence became too oppressive, I couldn't help but wonder if Sarah was truly gone. One evening, as I was settling down to read, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was another message from the unknown number. "You did well, but be careful. There are others out there." My blood ran cold. I tried to reply, but the message had already disappeared. I knew then that my journey wasn't over. The supernatural world I had unwittingly stumbled into was vast and filled with dangers I couldn't even begin to comprehend. But at least now, I was prepared. I had faced my fears and come out stronger on the other side. And if there were others out there who needed help, I was ready to answer the call.